Hi there, everyone. Thanks again for coming on to our Team Enough Zoom School webinar series. This afternoon, we will be covering debunking gun violence myths, encountering NRA talking points. With us this afternoon, we have Devin Hughes, who's one of the co-founders of GVPedia and a writer for the blog Armed with Reason, who has spent hours and hours really researching a lot of the common myths that the NRA and the corporate gun lobby put out around defensive gun use, and a lot of the research that's been put out by folks like John Lott and Gary Kleck, who are very prominent quote-unquote researchers on the NRA's side. And he has created a lot of material that we are very fortunate to be able to go through today around how we can combat those myths when we encounter them, whether it be in a conversation with our family or talking with a legislator. It's really good to also, for framing for ourselves how to be better advocates, how we can be better, better understand the issue holistically, and to quickly address something in the chat. Yes, I can send the link for this Zoom call in just a second, but real quick, I just want to turn it over to Devin to kick us off on the presentation on debunking gun violence myths. Devin, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Just wanted to make sure I hadn't muted myself again somehow. All right, so today I'm going to cover some of the most common pro-gun myths out there and how best to refute them. But before jumping into the program, let's see here. Okay, there we go. So one of the things that I've missed the most during quarantine is I actually teach a class at the University of Oklahoma, and I absolutely adore pop quizzes. Not really, but for the sake of doing so, I'm going to do a couple question pop quiz. I'm able to see responses in chat, so feel free to leave what you think the answer is there. So the first question is, which is more dangerous? An umbrella or a 50 caliber sniper rifle? And for those wondering, I'm the person in the cool looking hat on the very right hand side next to the 50 caliber sniper rifle. That was actually during the NRA convention a couple years ago. I managed to sneak in past security somehow and got to tour everything there. And so the correct answer, at least if you're in Oregon, is that obviously the umbrella is more dangerous than a 50 caliber sniper rifle. So this was about, I think, 5 or so years ago. The Oregon legislature decided to allow guns into where they pass laws. This is a real photograph right outside of the House of Representatives in Oregon. Meanwhile, umbrellas were prohibited because why? They could be used as a weapon and were therefore too dangerous. So while assault rifles were perfectly allowed in the Oregon state legislature, umbrellas had to be left outside. So next question, which takes longer, to become a yellow belt in Taekwondo or to become a firearms instructor that's NRA certified? And keep in mind, in many states, all you have to do to teach a firearms class or a concealed carry class is to be NRA certified. You don't have to have any other state qualifications. So the answer here, of course, is that yellow belt takes significantly longer, which is the second highest level in Taekwondo. It takes about 72 hours to get a yellow belt. Meanwhile, to become an NRA certified instructor in both handguns and rifles or shotguns, it takes about 40 hours. And these are the people who basically teach the entire class. And I actually asked the firearms instructor, like 40 hours, that sounds like relatively high from what I've heard. And apparently most of that 40 hours is just making sure you can read from the instruction manual. So the people who are supposed to be the most qualified to handle firearms and train the new generation of people carrying firearms aren't all that well trained even to begin with. So with the pop quiz out of the way, I want to jump straight into the common pro-gun arguments and leave plenty of time for a Q&A. Most pro-gun arguments revolve around the core myth that guns make us safer. And this myth manifests in multiple ways. Pro-gun advocates often claim that there's millions of defensive gun uses out there, basically good guys with guns stopping bad guys with guns. The idea that the more guns you have in society and the more people who are carrying guns, the less crime you will then see. That's a very popular myth that we'll dive into. Another extremely common one is that gun laws don't work. In fact, pro-gun advocates often take it further and say that gun laws make us less safe. Why? Because only law-abiding citizens follow gun laws and the criminals don't. And so therefore you're basically disarming good guys with guns and letting bad guys with guns roam free is the idea behind that myth. And then the final myth is that mass shooters or criminals try to target gun-free zones. Why? Because they feel they won't encounter any armed resistance and therefore it's an easy target. All of these myths can be refuted with a surface level of basic data, but then I'm going to go into the more complex arguments against each of them and the counterpoints that are often raised. So the basic data shows that guns don't make us safer. In fact, having a firearm in the home doubles the risk of homicide and triples the risk of suicide. And this comes from, I believe it was in 2014, a literature or a meta-analysis by Dr. Engelmeyer and some colleagues. And they analyzed more than 16 studies, and the synthesis of those 16 studies came to the conclusion that the risk of homicide doubled and the risk of suicide tripled by having a gun in the home. And that was for everybody in the home, not just the gun owner. And then for every time a firearm was fired in self-defense, there were at least 4 unintentional shootings, 7 criminal assaults or homicides, and 11 attempted or completed suicides. So while guns have been used in self-defense, it is extremely rare relative to the other types of shootings, and very clearly do not make a person with firearms safer, based just purely on the odds. However, to go a bit deeper, it's also the people you know. So it's not people who are strangers that you encounter in the street who pose the biggest threat. It's basically acquaintances and even friends. As one study found, for a 1% increase in gun ownership, there's a 0.9% increase in non-stranger homicide, so people you know. And there's only a small, statistically insignificant increase in stranger homicide. And because the threat's often from people we know, it makes it extremely difficult or implausible for using a gun in self-defense in those situations, because most people aren't going to expect that. So going a bit deeper into the pro-gun theory for why guns make us safer, it all hinges on deterrence theory. And there's 2 forms of deterrence. There's direct deterrence and indirect deterrence. So direct deterrence is when a good guy with a gun, in air quotes, is actively using a firearm in self-defense to stop a crime. Either somebody's attacking them or they see somebody carrying out a crime and they intervene with a firearm. They are directly deterring the crime. So that's one form, and the most common form most of the pro-gun myths settle on. You have to have a lot of direct deterrence in order for firearms to supposedly reduce crime. However, there's also indirect deterrence. So this is where even if a bad guy or criminal goes into a place and tries to, or is thinking about robbing the place or committing some form of crime, and he thinks that somebody that might be there with a gun, this theory holds that he would be less likely to attack a place that has good guys with guns in it. So therefore, he will attack gun-free zones or places where he's unlikely to face armed resistance. And so even if there aren't many direct deterrences or people having a defensive gun use, guns under this theory could still provide a benefit by just stopping people from ever committing a crime in the first place. So those are the two forms behind of the deterrence theory that are behind the guns make us safer myth. The most common form of this myth is the defensive gun use myth, and the claim that there's at least 2.5 million defensive gun uses annually. And this relies heavily on direct deterrence. So here's a bumper sticker form of the claim by the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association: more guns equal less crime, 2.5 million defensive gun uses each year. So it's an extremely popular and common argument. Where does it come from? It comes from a 1992 survey by Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz. In this survey, they went ahead and surveyed 5,000 individuals. And of those 5,000 individuals, 66 of them said that they had in fact had defensive gun use in the past year. This was slightly more than 1% of the adult population at the time. And so when Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz extrapolated these results to the entire United States population, they came up with 2.5 million defensive gun uses every year. And while this seems like an outlandish number, it is an outlandish number, as I'll get to in a moment, it was actually in line with other similar small private surveys. People were consistently finding around 1% or so of the people that they surveyed said they had defensive gun use in the past year. However, these small private surveys were contradicted with the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is a large survey that's been going on biannually since I think the 80s or 70s even. And that data indicated there's only around 100,000 defensive gun uses annually, which is still a relatively high number, but nowhere near as high as 2.5 million. And so there's a significant academic debate over this. Well, as it turns out, defensive gun use surveys have massive flaws. And the reason they have these flaws is that they are surveying a statistically rare event. Now, while 2.5 million is a lot, relative to the entire US population, it's only around 1%. And when you're trying to conduct a survey of a small percentage of the population, any sort of error that you have is going to be magnified significantly. So if you're off by just one person, it can throw the survey totals off by like 100,000 or so, simply because of just how small that is. And there's significant reasons to believe that these surveys are suffering from what's called a false positive problem, which is when a respondent answers incorrectly that they did have a defensive gun use when in fact they did not. And participants can do this for any number of reasons. So social desirability, where they want to appear heroic in front of the interviewer or even over the phone, to where the interviewer calls them up and asks, did you have defensive gun use? And they're like, well, yes, I did. It was awesome and heroic that I was able to stop the bad guy, even when in fact they didn't have anything like that happen to them. Some people just lie on surveys. That doesn't mean that all gun owners are liars or everybody who's going to be in a survey is going to lie. All it takes is 1% of the population, or 1 out of 100 people, saying something false, and all of a sudden you're off by 2.5 million. And there's also telescoping, where somebody actually did have a defensive gun use incident, and but it was 3 or 5 years ago. And they just happened to misremember during the interview that it was within the past year. And so that can also cause an overestimation. Further, there have been other surveys that took what the respondents answered and went ahead and sent them to a judge and told a panel of judges, all right, take these cases at face value. How many of these are legal? And the judges came back unanimously in the overwhelming majority of cases and found that at more than half of these reported defensive gun use cases were likely illegal, meaning it wasn't somebody using a firearm in self-defense, rather it was them basically attacking somebody with a firearm and then thinking that they had defensive gun use. And the final problem with these surveys is that there is no supporting empirical evidence to back this up. Usually with a survey, you're able to test, all right, how accurate is the survey? So if, for example, you want to know how many people have a subscription to some sort of gun magazine, for example, you can actually call up the person who's producing that magazine and figure out how many magazines have you sold. So you don't have to merely rely on the survey. You can rely on some hard data. And whenever we look at the hard data, it shows that the claim that there's 2.5 million defensive gun uses simply doesn't stand up. For example, one of CLEC's findings is that there were 845,000 defensive gun uses annually during burglaries. Yet we know from other data that there's approximately only 1.2 million burglaries annually. Only 33% of those had people in their home awake during the time of the burglary, and approximately 42% of households had a firearm. So even if burglars were just targeting gun owner homes, at most, only 182,000 defensive gun uses would even be possible. Yet the survey's finding that there's 845,000. So that indicates that there's something wrong with the survey. Another finding was that allegedly 200,000 criminals are shot annually in this survey. Yet there's at most 100,000 people at the time shot annually overall. And that includes unintentional death, unintentional shootings, suicides, and non-criminal use of firearms. So basically, it's twice as many as are even possible. And Gary Kleck claimed that, well, we have all these criminals who just aren't going to the hospital with these gunshot wounds, which is insane. And there have been follow-up surveys of prisoners and they asked, like, if you were shot, did you go to the hospital? And more than 90% of them said yes. So again, no evidence for 2.5 million defensive gun uses. The survey also claims that 1.6 million defensive gun uses are reported to the police. Yet the Gun Violence Archive actually tracks verified defensive gun uses reported by the police or in the media, and they're only able to find 2,000 verified on an annual basis. And so what the reality of defensive gun uses looks like is this, where you have hundreds of thousands of abuses and thefts, tens of thousands of injuries, and 39,000 deaths annually, compared with only around 2,000 verified defensive gun uses. And these defensive gun uses don't have to be, aren't necessarily socially good. Sometimes it's two rival drug dealers going at it or something like that, and one of them does technically have a defensive gun use. So the beneficial uses of firearms are far outweighed by the harmful uses of firearms. And one of the counters that pro-gun advocates often throw to this is like, well, not everybody reports it to the police. It's like, well, yes, but in the very survey that you're citing, 1.6 million were supposedly reported to the police, over half of them. And so that would mean Well, if only half are reported to the police, that means overall there'd be 4,000 defensive gun uses then, not 2.5 million. So there's basically zero empirical support for the idea that defensive gun use is widespread. And all the best available data indicates that it is extremely rare. So moving to the next myth, the idea that if you have more guns and less crime. And this is a very simplified version of it with a very nice looking graphic, I must say, from the National Rifle Association. And it shows violent crime going down while the number of new guns goes up. Of course, this in itself is highly misleading because what that's measuring is the number of new guns, not the level of gun ownership. And when you actually look at the level of gun ownership during that period, it's going down along with the violent crime rate. How is that possible? Well, somebody can own multiple guns. And in fact, there have been multiple surveys that have found that the top 20% of gun owners own more than 80% of the firearms. So it's not more people buying guns, it's fewer people buying more guns that's been occurring. And if you're going to have a crime reducing effect from gun ownership, it's on the fact somebody owns a gun, not whether they own one gun versus 1,000 guns. All you need is one to stop a crime. So where does this myth originate? It comes from Crime Deterrence and Right to Carry, Concealed Handguns by John Lott and David Mustard. This was in 1996, and it found that if all states had adopted shall issue laws, meaning all you have to do to carry a concealed gun is pass the class in a background check, and the police are forced to give you a permit. So if all states had adopted these shall issue laws by 1992, otherwise known as right to carry laws, 1,500 murders, 4,000 rapes, 11,000 robberies, and 60,000 aggravated assaults would be avoided every year. And John Lott then turned that study into the book More Guns, Less Crime, which is essentially the statistical Bible of the NRA. If there's a pro-gun myth out there that's not the defensive gun use one, odds are it originated in John Lott's book. Of course, his work on this was highly hotly debated at the time, and there's a war of studies that occurred in the 90s and early 2000s over whether right to carry laws actually reduced crime. So finally, in 2004, the National Research Council panel unveiled this report that looked at a number of gun laws, but they devoted an entire chapter to the question of right to carry, and they found no support for more guns, less crime. And later studies have found that the most consistent, albeit not uniform, finding to emerge from the array of models is that aggravated assault rises when right to carry laws are adopted. So newer and better research has found that, in fact, right to carry laws actually increase crime. And this is before getting into who John Lott is. So he has despite being widely cited, including in places like the Washington Post, he's published in the New York Times, and he's been quoted by even our current president of the United States, and is still treated by an expert by far too many people. And yet he's fabricated a large survey in the past. He's presented faulty regression analysis on multiple occasions. He actually pretended to be a female student of his online to protect himself from criticism. He's invented fake statistics and lied about much more. And afterwards in the Q&A session, if you want to learn more about John Lott, boy, do I have a lot of stories. But basically, John Lott is not credible whatsoever. And he was the main force behind the idea that more guns equals less crime. And the research has really moved on. If you look at the more modern research after the National Research Council panel's findings from 2007 to 2018, there have been 18 studies on right to carry laws. 11 of them, so 61%, found that right to carry laws increased crime. And 3 studies found that right to carry laws decreased crime. And the other 4 either had mixed or no effects. So basically, the overwhelming majority of the modern research finds that right to carry laws increase crime. So more guns does not mean less crime. And in fact, it means the opposite. Moving on to another very popular myth is the ones that gun laws don't work, or another way you might have heard is, well, criminals don't follow laws. And just going through Google images of really awful memes, you'll often find this one, which points to Chicago, #1 in gun control, #1 in murder and gang violence, none of which is actually true. When we look at where Chicago in particular stacks up versus other cities, it's still extremely violent, and Chicago does have a massive gun violence problem. But, and yes, it is a very cursed boomer image, I agree. It's St. Louis, Baltimore, New Orleans, Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, Memphis, Newark. And while some of these cities are in the quote-unquote liberal Northeast, St. Louis is in Missouri, which is very pro-gun. New Orleans is in Louisiana, which is one of the most pro-gun states out there. Cleveland's in Ohio. Kansas City is in Missouri, not Kansas. And Memphis is in Tennessee. So basically, there's these cities and areas that do have lots of supposedly good guys with guns around, and yet they still have problems. And they're frequently in states that have preemption laws, where the city itself cannot do anything because the basically pro-gun legislature in these conservative states have told them they can't do anything, and then they weaken the laws. So these cities are basically defenseless to prevent gun violence. And part of the problem, particularly with Chicago, but many of these other cities, is that they aren't on an island like Hawaii. So they often neighbor terrible states with very weak gun laws, and those weak gun laws make it extremely easy for criminal organizations to get their hands on firearms, to import them from, say, Indiana, where all they have to do is drive an hour or 2 over the border and get all the guns they could ever desire. Why? Because Indiana has extremely weak gun laws and allows private sales without background checks. And so while Illinois and Chicago can try to strengthen their gun laws, in the end, and those strengthened gun laws do actually have a beneficial impact, it's still not enough when your neighbor is Indiana, who's doing everything in its power to make things worse, it seems. And overall, laws do matter. And first, the idea that criminals don't follow laws, so therefore, like what, why bother with laws? First, that's a recipe for anarchy, because why would you have any laws if your measure of whether a law works or not is if all the criminals follow those laws? It basically destroys itself with logic. And then the other part is that, like, criminals do respond to incentives. Simply because a criminal goes up to a red light at an intersection doesn't mean that they have to run that red light because they're a criminal. Instead, they'll choose the path of least resistance. And oftentimes, states are making it as easy as possible for that path of least resistance to include a firearm. And that's incredibly dangerous. And we can see that with states with weaker gun laws, which are rated F by Giffords, or states with stronger laws that are rated A's. And my home state of Oklahoma is highlighted here as one of the states with very, very weak laws. And it pays for it with more gun deaths. And to give an example of these gun laws, here's the states with the toughest laws. This is an old graphic from 2013, but it still holds up, unfortunately. Hawaii has the least, along with Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And you'll see most of these states have permit to purchase, which is one of the strongest laws to combat gun violence. They have, all of them have universal background checks. A couple of them have handgun registration. None of them have stand your ground laws. It's very difficult to get a concealed carry permit in those states. Some of the states have it easy to get an open carry permit, but that can be due to hunting regulations. And then a couple of them do have a waiting period. Now contrast this with Oklahoma, where we have 16.4 per 100,000 gun deaths versus 2.5 for Hawaii. Of course, we don't have a permit to purchase a handgun. In fact, I imagine the legislature in the coming years will try to force everybody to own a handgun, and that would occur sooner than a permit to purchase. Background checks, of course, we don't have it on all sales. No registration, because that's something communists do, apparently. Of course, we have stand your ground law, easy to get a concealed carry permit. In fact, since this graphic, we made it to where you don't even need a concealed carry permit to publicly carry a firearm. So basically, you could get a handgun through a private sale and then concealed carry that almost anywhere you want in the state, having never undergone a background check. At least we made it moderately difficult to get an open carry permit, by which we actually have one, I guess. And then we have no waiting period for handguns. So this alone just shows how big a deal having stronger gun laws is. Gun laws do work. And some of the best laws to reduce gun violence, discretionary permit to purchase, where basically police sign off on whether somebody is able to get a permit. And of course, you can attach fingerprinting to that permit, training, basically whatever you want, and then it can be like a driver's license in a way, but you have significant training to get there. Gun removal for domestic violence convictions and protective orders, like extreme risk protection orders, are key in reducing gun violence, particularly domestic violence. Audits of gun dealers are a massive deal. So one of my favorite stories, which is kind of horrifying, is Arkansas in, I want to say it was 2014, had reported 300 firearms lost or stolen in the entire state. In 2015, the ATF gets a tip that, hey, one of these gun stores might be doing something nefarious. They might be selling guns out the back, or this looks like a disreputable gun store, essentially. So the ATF conducts one of its audits. And keep in mind that the ATF is only able to audit 7% of gun stores annually. So they're missing quite a lot. So they come into Arkansas into this gun store, and sure enough, the gun store's like, oh my gosh, we have all these lost or stolen firearms. We have no clue what happened to them. Our bad. So the number from the entire state, in 2014 it was 300. It jumped to 3,000 in 2015. And that was due to just auditing one gun store. Now imagine if instead of 7% of gun stores annually, the ATF was able to audit something like 30% or even 50%. How many more firearms and bad actors they would be able to find. So audits of gun dealers is a big deal. Child access prevention laws, particularly strong laws with a felony penalty attached for endangering children if the firearm does get into the wrong hands, have been shown to significantly reduce child firearm deaths. Now, weak child access prevention laws don't have as good of an effect, but those attached with a strong penalty, the academic evidence is quite significant on those. community-led programs such as ceasefire programs or cure violence programs, basically community-led, community-run, that takes all the community leaders and stakeholders, brings them together, and tries to find solutions at the local level to reduce gun violence, are quite critical and important at reducing violence, particularly in cities. That being said, having strong gun laws also helps, because for these programs to be fully effective, they need to make sure once they get guns off the streets, that those guns stay off the streets. Because if it's in a state with weak gun laws, one or two bad actors can all of a sudden flood the market again with firearms, and everybody's back to where they started. And so you've seen massive success of these programs. Boston's had some good success with it. Richmond, California had some good success with program. There's some encouraging signs in Baltimore with some of the programs. So these are important tools that aren't necessarily a federal or even state law, but are still quite important. And then finally, one of the things I've done is I hosted a conference last year, and one of the main things to come out of that conference was the Denver Accord, which is a comprehensive list of policies and programs designed to reduce gun violence. And so you can find that at denveraccord.org. And it contains not just these laws, but many other laws and programs that, when working together, can reduce gun violence significantly. All right, moving to the final of these myths, which is the gun-free zone myth. Basically, the idea that mass shooters target gun-free zones. Why? Because according to another pro-gun meme out there, it's like shooting fish in a barrel, which is a horrific meme, but that's the claim. Basically, you need a good guy with a gun, otherwise mass shooters just will do whatever they want. And where does this come from? It comes from John Lott, yet again. Since 2014, John Lott's claimed that 98% or more of mass shootings from 1950 to the present have occurred in gun-free zones. And he claims shooters target gun-free zones because they know they won't face armed resistance. And he's basically challenges everybody to look at his data, and they'll see that he's 100% accurate, which, spoiler alert, he's not. And this is a very popular myth. So in 2018 at the NRA convention, Donald Trump even quoted John Lott, basically said 98% mass public shootings have occurred in places where guns are banned, just so you understand. And fact checkers have largely dropped the ball on this. They've rated claims like this half true at PolitiFact, or in the Washington Post, only 2 Pinocchios, which is their equivalent of half true. Yet the reality is markedly different. A study by Louis Clarivas found that of 111 high fatality rampage shootings, 84% occurred in areas that allowed guns. So where's the massive discrepancy coming from? Well, it turns out that John Lott, as he's wont to do, fudged the data. So I wrote an article last year where I actually looked into his data and found that he either A, made a massive data error, or B, deliberately falsified the data to where from 1977 to 1997, in a period where many states did not have right to carry laws, so by definition, according to Lott, were basically gun-free, he was counting each mass shooting fatality as a mass shooting. So for example, in 1986, his data showed 14 mass shootings in Oklahoma, but we didn't have 14 mass shootings that year. We just had one in which 14 people were killed. And the reason this makes such a difference is every single one of these mass shootings, he was counting as occurring in a gun-free zone. So all of a sudden that would massively bolster the percentage of shootings that occurred in a gun-free zone while significantly reducing the percentage of shootings that did not. And so I called this out, and a month or two later, he sneakily changed his data from where he had 247 shootings between 1977 and 1997. It turned out to only be 50, according to his definition. And even after this, he was then claiming, oh, well, now it's 94%. He still undercounts incidents, has a really bad definition for it, and is basically still falsifying the data, just not as badly as he was before. So if you ever hear the talking point that, oh, all these shootings are occurring in gun-free zones, this is where it comes from. And it's completely bogus on multiple levels. And so just to recap, we've gone through the core myth that guns make us safer, which has the 4 key parts of widespread defensive gun use, which is not the case. There's only 2,000 verified defensive gun uses annually. More guns does not mean less crime. In fact, right to carry laws actually increase crime. Gun laws actually do have a substantial impact at saving lives. And finally, there's no evidence or no substantive evidence that gun-free zones attract mass shooters. And so all of those are debunked. And I'll go ahead and open it up for Q&A.
Awesome. And hey, everyone, this is Robert. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the way that we're going to conduct our Q&A session this afternoon is please, any questions that you have for Devin, put in the group chat here on the Zoom call. So that way you don't have to worry about battling over access to the mic with anyone. We will read through your questions, make sure that they are answered. We have about 15 minutes left in the call. And just to go ahead and get us started, Devin, you were mentioning some of the permitless carry that goes on in states like Oklahoma. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the term constitutional carry that the NRA and its proponents often use, kind of where that generated from, and what's a good way to combat that type of messaging.
So the idea behind constitutional carry, there's the philosophical idea where, in their interpretation of the Second Amendment, the well-regulated portion of it does not exist, to where basically the Second Amendment is our guarantee to have arms, any type of arms whatsoever that we could ever desire, and carry them wherever we want, because that's what the Constitution that was written by God and passed down to Moses, I suppose, that's what was intended there. And so, I mean, philosophically, it's absurd. The most pro-gun DC versus Heller ruling ever basically showed that the right was not unlimited, even though they went through this ridiculous historical argument that was horribly flawed. Even that found that longstanding prohibitions on guns in certain places and regulation should not be overturned due to it. All it basically said is, in the home, you have the right to own a firearm, subject to prohibitions on dangerous people and such. So it actually changed relatively little in terms of like whether permit to purchase is allowed and stuff like that. Now there is talk that those will be re-challenged in the coming years, but the Supreme Court still doesn't seem to want to take the issue up, fortunately, given the composition of the current court. In terms of how to battle it at the state level, it's actually trickier because most states have a version of the Second Amendment that's far more tailored towards an individual right. And in Oklahoma, where we have an overwhelming supermajority of Republicans, where it's like 70% of the legislature at least is Republican, there's not much you can do. One of the things that we're going to do before the quarantine happened was a state ballot initiative, because the overwhelming majority of people reject having permitless carry. And permitless carry and constitutional carry, they're essentially the same thing. And there's been some recent evidence, I've written on it a little bit, that permitless carry is even worse than concealed carry in terms of crime rates, but it's going to be years before more thorough studies come out. So basically, to argue against it, it's basically a worse form of right to carry. Want me to go ahead and address the next question?
Yes.
Okay, how do we combat the notion that it's critical to arm a populace against an oppressive government? Remind people that drones exist, and that basically if you're bringing a gun to a drone fight, you've kind of already lost. And also it's like, all right, so you're wanting to shoot our soldiers while you're waving the American flag and talking about how proud of our military you are. So I mean, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance around there, but for the most part, I try to avoid that argument largely because the people who present that argument are, you're not going to persuade them anyway. And it goes down this long historical rabbit hole, basically showing that like, hey, look, the Second Amendment was written with a well-regulated militia in mind. Who regulated that militia? The government. And so it just gets into a back and forth that's like, it's not an argument that can necessarily be won in a meaningful sense. So I always try to pivot to the public health and public safety perspective, because more people find that convincing, and the people who find the other argument convincing, you're not going to convince anyway. Okay. Next question is, for the updated, more accurate gun-free zone figure from Johns Hopkins, what did they do differently from Lott other than not counting each individual mass shooting death as a specific mass shooting to find that 84% occurred in gun-allowing zones rather than 98 to 94% gun-free zones? So there's a couple things. First, they looked at high fatality rampage shootings, which is 6 or more shot in a public space rather than 4 or more. This was simply to make sure they weren't missing data. Then what John Lott has this weird definition to where basically, for example, like the Pulse nightclub shooting, John Lott considers that a gun-free zone, even though there was an armed guard that engaged the shooter there. He still considers that a gun-free zone because nobody inside the club could carry a firearm there. He mislabels some, like for example, there's a shooting in Hialeah, Florida at a small cafe. He argues that it's basically a taco shop. Because it had a bar, you couldn't carry, but there's specific evidence from the state of Florida that they actually were allowed to carry in the restaurant. So he mislabels stuff like that. There's certain states where, because they have a low percentage of concealed carry permits, he decides the entire state is a gun-free zone or the entire city is a gun-free zone because the percentage of people carrying firearms is too low for him. So he does a lot of subjective things like that to tilt the numbers, and then he basically, so it's whether the state has right to carry laws and then whether there's enough people carrying in the state are his two kind of criteria, whereas this definition looks more as like, hey, was there actually somebody there with a firearm? Are people just allowed, not based on some subjective reading of how many permits there were there? And so, and then also they don't fall into the data errors that are quite significant with Lott's data set. So there's a lot of stuff basically that finds that he's just wrong. I wrote an article for the Trace. If you go to the Trace and search the Armed with Reason tab, the first article I wrote for them was on the gun-free zone myth, and it provides a more detailed argument about this. All right, next question. I saw an article by a woman in the military who is essentially like, one grenade and you're out. Your gun isn't going to save you from the government. Yeah, or one Tomahawk missile, or basically, I mean, yeah, the idea that our current pro-gun people are going to save the country from a tyrannical force, like, would be funny if they weren't actually kind of dangerous. And like, it's one of those things that's relatively easy to mock, but again, like, you're not going to convince those people that they're wrong. Basically, like, those people, when they have a gun, it's like, oh, I have a gun, therefore I'm invincible, and I'm just better with a gun than everybody else. And it simply isn't going to be the case. More questions? What are some other resources folks can utilize to learn more about combating the spread of NRA disinformation, both in person and online? So, shameless plug for myself, GVPedia.org has the largest publicly available database of gun violence studies that we're aware of. It has, I think it's more than 1,000 currently. We're in the process of updating with more studies. So there's that resource. If you're interested in the defensive gun use, we have a series of 3 videos on YouTube under GVPedia Explains that has that. I have several articles on medium.com. My old blog, armedwithreason.com, has multiple articles as well. I have multiple articles on the Trace under the Armed with Reason tab. And you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. In terms of other sources, Giffords is extremely helpful for gun law information. Brady has some excellent resources. Coalition to Stop Gun Violence has excellent resources on suicide prevention. The Harvard website page for their Gun Violence Research Center has a lot of good information. Same with the University of California at Davis group. And then Johns Hopkins also has excellent resources. And I think the Johns Hopkins massive online course is still available on Coursera, which contains some useful information as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Devin, for taking the time this afternoon to speak with all of us. If you have any questions before we wrap things up, please put them in the chat so we can make sure to answer them. Just to touch on the Johns Hopkins massive online course, yes, it's still on Coursera. I had the opportunity to take it last year when it came out, and it's a fantastic resource where you can learn a lot more about the facts and statistics behind gun violence prevention research that back up a lot of the policies that we're talking about. And there are sections talking about some of the research from the other side that we've discussed in this call today. Johns Hopkins is also putting together a summer youth online kind of virtual academy that takes place at the latter half of July. It is an intensive 5-day course that will be covering a wide range of topics around gun violence prevention policy, and applications are actually live right now. And so there's been a bunch of flyers going around about it, but it's online at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy website. You can find the sign up there. It's for folks from the ages of 14 to 18. And so if you fall within that age range and sounds interesting to you, definitely just wanted to flag that resource so you can take advantage of it. And then finally, in terms of the Zoom school, next week, Thursday, we are going to be having another call at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and it's going to be with Mark Collins from Brady about priority federal gun violence prevention legislation, how far we've gotten in this session, but also what are we really looking at next session and why. And this is going to be a continuation of our conversation Thursday. We're looking at the state level, and we're going to be talking about it more federally this upcoming Thursday at 3. So thank you again for everyone who was able to make the call this afternoon. Thank you again, Devin, for taking time out of your schedule to speak with us about how we can combat this NRA disinformation and be more knowledgeable about the defensive gun use. And I look forward to talking to you all again on Thursday. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for having me.